A charred cross, burned as an act of terror by the Ku Klux Klan 50 years ago on the lawn of Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi, would later journey to desegregate the United Methodist Church and to inspire civil rights activists marching in solidarity for racial justice. Today it stands in the sanctuary of the First United Methodist Church Chicago Temple as a symbol of hope and forgiveness, an icon of the universal Christian story of a suffering Christ who reminds us the cross is still burning and the struggle is not over. Contributing editor Phil Blackwell tells the remarkable story of this single cross, the people who carried it, and the struggle that is ongoing. It'll challenge what you think about your politics and your faith today on Sanctuary.
The sculpture is based upon a cross that was burned on the lawn of Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi in the autumn of 1963. The students were being encouraged by Ed King, the campus minister, to go into the city and try and desegregate the churches on Sunday morning. And that not only led to the arrests of the students, but also had the KKK come and burn this cross on the college lawn. Ed King put it out, gave the cross to the United Methodists, who were in the process of trying to desegregate the denomination nationally, so that this cross became really the symbol for the desegregation of our denomination in 1964 to 1968. He was taken to Pittsburgh at the General Conference and walked around the conference hall and became the rallying point. After all of that, the cross was given to Gerald Forshey, a pastor here in Chicago, who brought it back and took it to Jack Carney, who is a very well-regarded sculptor in town. Carney took that charred wooden cross, encased it in kind of a skin of metal so it wouldn't disintegrate, and then placed on it this obviously African-American, distressed, truncated Christ. And so Jerry's had this sculpture for over 40 years in his own possession. He wanted to be sure that this church received it so that we could put it on public display. And so this has been not only a gift to the church, but also one that we want to make available to people who can come by and know the story and know that it's not only something that refers back to 1963, but has a great deal of power today. We had a guest over the summer who came to worship. He was a retired university administrator from Mississippi. He took a look at this and saw the figure on the cross and immediately said, "That's James Chaney." The sculptor wasn't so clear that that was the model he was using, but in fact, James Chaney was one of the 3 young men who were murdered when they were trying to register voters in Mississippi in 1963, and the only African American among the 3. And so at least for that person, he saw in this figure that historical moment. And as an historian who knows Chicago inside out, you sense a history between Jackson, Mississippi and Chicago that goes back long before this cross being burned. Where do you start that history that then begins to lead up to our understanding of what this sculpture means?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things is particularly the 20th century history of Mississippi, and particularly Jackson and Chicago, are very interrelated because of people. Because many people who migrate from Jackson and from its environs in Mississippi, mostly African Americans, move to Chicago, and they're going to have a transformative effect on Chicago's history in the 20th century and in the 21st century. And the ties between Jackson and Chicago then are family ties, they're individual ties, they're ties of people who have had to leave their family and their homes to make a life in Chicago.
Brenda, the The cross that's at the heart of our discussion was burned in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963. You were 3 years old at the time, so you didn't know about that. But from that time on, you really grew up with the civil rights movement as part of your family.
Well, I grew up in Alabama, which geographically made it possible for me to experience a lot of what was going on. My family, by choice, had decided to be involved. My uncle, Ralph Abernathy, and he was a minister leading the church in Montgomery. He befriended the pastors there and became very good friends with the new pastor, Martin Luther King Jr., and he and his wife, Coretta, had also just moved to Montgomery and were beginning the ministry there. So I learned growing up what it was like to have a commitment and to get involved, and it seemed to me that there wasn't a choice. It was your privilege to be able to be at the pinnacle of making change, of being able to make a difference, because so many people couldn't.
Okay. And so the sculpture that is now residing in the Chicago Temple building, the cross being that which was burned on the college campus in Jackson, and then this clearly truncated, distressed African-American Jesus on it. Mm-hmm. When you look at that today, what do you see?
I think I see it reminds me certainly of the lynchings, and it reminds me of the horror because people were burned, effigies were burned, and people were just tortured, and it reminds me of the price of freedom.
My name is Thomas Armstrong. Well, actually, I first got engaged into the civil rights movement back in late 1958. I was a freshman student at Tougaloo College at the time, and Tougaloo College actually located about 10 miles north of Jackson. One night I happened to go into Jackson to one of the churches there to a mass meeting. Mass meetings were meetings where, well, they were instructional type meetings that gave instruction to the community relative to civic education projects that was going to take place in the coming week. At that meeting, there was a young man by the name of Medgar Evers who was moderating that meeting. Medgar was the first field secretary for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People at that time. He was giving us a layout of what had been going on in the state relative to voter registration. In my home county of Jefferson Davis County, Mississippi, more than 1,000 individuals had been stricken from the rolls in 1956. He even called out some names of people throughout the state that had been taken off the rolls. And just, I guess, coincidentally, he named some people that I knew, and he named a couple of relatives of mine. So I felt, at the end of that meeting, when he called for volunteers to help go out into the various small towns and hamlets and help people, or rather teach people how to register in Mississippi, otherwise teach them the Mississippi voter registration process. So I felt I had no choice but to, join up with them. And so that's how I first got into the movement.
The cross that is at the base of this sculpture,
Yeah.
burned on Tougaloo College campus October 6th, 1963,
Yeah.
World Communion Sunday.
Yeah.
Ed King, the campus minister, who is white, taking students, primarily African-American students, to church at various churches in the city, downtown Jackson.
Right.
They get turned away. The cross is burned on that Sunday evening. The story then continues of trying to introduce African-American students to congregations in Jackson.
Right.
it escalates to the point that now Jerry Forshey and Martin Deppe and a number of others go from here down there. Again, the reverse migration, but
Right.
you're saying that Jerry and the others already had their decade of history here
Right.
to prepare them for going down there.
Right, right. And I think many of those ministers, they're coming into Chicago too, and they're seeing it with the eyes of arriving in Chicago and seeing what needed to be done in Chicago. And then they're also looking, they're looking beyond Chicago to what can be done. And I think one of the things that became clear to me is that it's the connections of where people went to seminary, it's their friends nationally that bring the ministers from Chicago, it brings them to Jackson. So it's their congregants, it's also their connections then that draw them to Mississippi. And Mississippi is one of the centers for the showdowns for civil rights in 1963 and 1964. It's very violent, it's dangerous. That cross burning on Reverend Ed King's lawn is not benign. That is, again, in the context of a summer of violence, and that's a threat in a very profound way. And so the bravery of the Tougaloo College students to continue in their efforts to desegregate the churches in Jackson, and the bravery of the ministers from Chicago and elsewhere, but certainly these ministers in Chicago to come and stand witness to this is something that I don't think we should underestimate, because I think it was very much putting their lives on the line.
Ed King had developed another method of protest. He felt that if he could reach the good people in the church, he felt that he could make more progress in terms of not only integration, but uplifting the whole attitudes of the state of Mississippi. Well, anyway, on Sunday mornings, there were 5 or 6 of us. Sometimes it diminished 10, really. We get dressed in our one suit and our one tie, and we go to a white church in Jackson, Mississippi. We were never allowed inside of the white churches. Many of us were arrested right there on the steps of the church. Many ministers from northern states found out about our plight at that particular point, and they came down to Mississippi and joined us. In fact, you had one right here from Chicago, Martin Deppe. He was a Methodist minister at the time.
There was a lot happening in your ministry and in Chicago before we get to Jackson in 1963. What was leading up to all of these activities that we now transfer to Jackson, but you were working hard here in Chicago?
Well, the big fight in Chicago was in education, because the school system was so segregated, and the whole black population was contained, so to speak. The youth were contained in those schools, and they were fearing any transfer into the white areas. And so we picketed every week on the south side against the so-called Willis wagons. These were portable school rooms that were out on the lawn in the schoolyard. Benjamin Willis, the superintendent of schools, was using these units to contain the black community. And so that was one of the first protests that really got going very strong at the same time as Birmingham was occurring in the South, and Dr. King was writing his famous letter from the Birmingham jail.
It was not a matter of that the civil rights movement was only needing to be played out in the Deep South. They understood before they left, but understood even better when they came back, that the civil rights movement had a tremendous task ahead in Chicago. And to my mind, they devoted their lives in one way or another to the task of fighting for civil rights in Chicago. And we're successful in various ways to various degrees, right? In a city which can remain incredibly divided racially, right down to 2013.
We got the nerve to talk about progress. Little kids stepping over bodies on their way to school. School finna close, city talking about profits. Then they wonder why we rap, join gangs, women degrading themselves cause you told us we were objects and never gave us the access to legally get it, and so the drug dealers turn into the prophets. Trayvon Martin next to Emmett Till make it look like 50 years of progress got offset. Make me wanna march? Nah, make me wanna throw water on the cross still burning on my lawn, then turn it to a bronze work of art. Let the world know we create out of devastation the new nation. Believing God prevails and knowing evil is real, but still, we got the nerve to talk about progress.
Julian, you've looked at the sculpture that's a focal point of our discussion around issues of race and civil rights. And that sculpture's older than you are by some, and certainly that story of it being burned on the college campus and on the lawn in 1963 predates you. Nevertheless, when you look at that sculpture, what is it that you see in the sculpture and also in the history about it? Why does that matter to you in any way?
Well, when I look at it as a young person, I see resilience. I see a people who wouldn't let devastation be the end of the story, that destruction does not rule the day. And but that's from a historical perspective, and I try to see it historically, but I wasn't there. And so the challenge for me, from my generation, is to try to make sense of something that we can't understand. Crosses don't burn in our lawns now. But if we can struggle a little bit and think about our own suffering and think about the suffering that's still happening around us, then we can use it, I think, as metaphor, whereas an older generation had to see it as something happening, physical, tangible. There's a cross right there. How do we make sense of no cross but still suffering?
It is our responsibility to make the world a better place. America has not yet reached its, quote, United States moment. We are the yet-to-be United States of America. And those are the challenges that this generation will constantly, consistently have to confront.
When Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. And when you think about why, in the African American community at least, there's a lot of pain around what happened here, I think it's important to recognize that the African American community is looking at this issue through a set of experiences and a history that doesn't go away. You know, there are very few African American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me, at least before I was a senator. There are very few African Americans who haven't had the experience of getting on an elevator and a woman clutching her purse nervously and holding her breath until she had a chance to get off. That happens often. And you know, I don't want to exaggerate this, but those sets of experiences inform how the African American community interprets what happened one night in Florida.
President Barack Obama commented on the Trayvon Martin case and commented very personally about it and about his children. What do you say to your children and to the children of your congregation about that?
Well, first I want to mention that I was so proud of our president at that moment. It was, to me, a very personal and moving an accurate statement about what was happening in Florida. And no other president in history has ever addressed the issue of inequality and racialized perspective in the United States the way that President Obama has. To raise the question that if Trayvon Martin was of a different color, would we have this same conversation? To raise the question that I could have had a son that looked like Trayvon Martin was very powerful. But he raised the question of what many call the racialized imagination. The racialized imagination is simply that when George Zimmerman witnessed a gentleman who was in his neighborhood, he immediately othered that person, as he had done several times before on 911 calls. Every 911 call he ever gave was always about a young African-American man who was in the neighborhood who didn't belong. He othered that person. That person does not belong in our community. That person is not a citizen of the United States, and therefore I have the right to remove this person who is not a part of my community. That's a real powerful and challenging issue for us to confront, the othering of the racial imagination. And the president talked about that. Never before in the history of the country have we had a president to talk about that. And what it did, I think, for many people across this country, with all of the anxiety and frustration that many people felt, especially myself as a parent, about what about my children, with the challenges economically and education, and then also dealing with the racialized imagination. How do we communicate to our children? The president became pastor-in-chief and also commander-in-chief at that moment.
Trayvon Martin could be me. It could be any black person. You have to remember that we've gone through that. People of my generation, beginning with Emmett Till. Emmett Till and I were the same age. When my community first heard about what had happened to Emmett Till, young people, my age, we were 14 at the time, you would see walking around with tears in their eyes. You see. Now, same thing, Trayvon Martin. Yeah. So we knew that we had gone through that. We know what it was like. Some people like to say that this is a post-racial era. Look around you and see what's going on. And, that's all I have to say.
As much as people want to say that doesn't matter anymore, or that's not happening, why are you bringing this up? It's just too much of a reality. It might not be your reality, but we have to understand our connectedness, and that if you go into the south and west side of Chicago, it is happening. There's no denying that. There's no denying the realities of violence and drugs and the ways in which those are tied to families being broken and lack of education, and the ways in which young black and brown boys are being profiled still. I just think it's too much of a reality that when you see it, you can't deny it. You just can't.
We believe that Jesus focused his life and his witness for those who have their backs against the wall. It may be someone who's black. It also may be someone who's brown. It may be someone who is an immigrant, or as Rez Aslan has said, when he came to this country as an Iranian, he said this on Bill Maher, he said, for the first 10 years, I tried to act as if I was Mexican, because I thought that maybe if you were Mexican-American, you will have it better. But in the reality, I was still considered an other, because was not of European descent. I was considered to be outside of being a true American. And that is at the heart of America's problem, is that othering, this racialized imagination, is a part of the core of the development of the country. And so it's part of the faith community's job to exercise that demon.
The young people have to write their own stories, and they've got to be involved on these issues where they live, and get past the chaff and get into the substance of the problems. Why we have the Trayvon Martin stories, that we should run with that. We should expose that and look at it and use it as a teachable moment for our young people. So it's both the story that we have to tell and the story they have to write for themselves.
The weight of history in the United States is filled with racial injustice, and it's not a story that's over by any means. I think it's a fight that we will continue to wage for this generation and probably for generations to come.
I am absolutely the beneficiary of people continuing to work for progress in the workplace and in education. I was able to apply for scholarships all over. I was able to apply for summer jobs like anybody else. I was able to get work after college and be interviewed on campus if I wanted, like others. I didn't have any of those restrictions, and I know it's because people made it important for employers to not discriminate on the basis of race or gender.
Whatever we have to do to try to represent people, that it's not about revolution as much as it is about being with people. And that's what we need most. That's what we need our churches to do. That's what I'm trying to do right now.
I do think that it's important for young people to know that the work isn't finished. We are not in a post-racial society. We're still divided by race. It's not dogs barking, it's not crosses burning, and it's not people hanging from trees, but it's just as insidious when someone is limited in terms of what the expectations are for what they can do based on race, and that is still with us.
We're glad you've been with us for this special edition of our program on issues and ideas at the intersection of life and faith, and we want to hear from you. For more information on The Cross is Still Burning, email us at gcbm@ameritech.net, visit our website at gcbm.org, and write to us in care of Sanctuary, the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries, 77 West Washington, Chicago 60602. That's Sanctuary, the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries, 77 West Washington Street, Chicago 60602. I'm Lydia Talbot. Thanks for keeping faith with us today on Sanctuary. May peace with justice be with you.
Thank you.